Welcome back to Fuel Up Classic. Now, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. It makes all the difference. And this channel is all about showcasing classic cars, whether they be vintage, whether they be iconic, and perhaps some really obscure stuff that you've never heard of as well. But the chances are, even if you're not into cars, you can probably recognize what this car is. Today's a big day for me. I'm a huge Range Rover fan. I happen to own a four-door Classic, but this is the daddy of them all. This is the original Range Rover two-door. I've never been behind the wheel of one before. I've always wanted to, and I've always wanted to own one. And now I've got my hands on one. So I'm going to be taking it out for a drive. I'm going to tell you what my experience behind the wheel is all about, what you should look out for if you're thinking about buying one, and also what you should expect to pay as well. Anyone that's owned a car fitted with that Rover V8 will know that there's few finer things in life than starting one of them up on a cold, frosty morning. It makes a glorious V8 burble. It's a fantastic engine. It's the heart and soul of a Range Rover. But let's take it out for a drive and see if the two-door Range Rover lives up to all the hype. So the first thing you'll hear is the fuel pump clicking away, little bit of choke on a cold morning, and then just a really, really nice V8 burble. We're going to have choke on for a few miles whilst it all warms up. But this car has had a relatively recent engine rebuild, so it's a very healthy 3.5 litre V8. The idea of a more road-focused Land Rover that was more refined and perhaps for a more upmarket clientele was nothing new. In fact, plans go back decades before the Range Rover ever even made the drawing board. There had been a Road Rover project, but that never really took off the ground. But it really did start the ball rolling for the Range Rover. And whereas we've got iconic names linked with car design, such as Sir William Lyons or Alec Izagonis, Charles Spencer King is the name that's always associated with the Range Rover. He was an absolute genius. King was honoured with his very own limited edition Range Rover two-door in 1990. Called the CSK, those cars are highly collectible. Now, you could pay £80,000 to £90,000 for the very best example. So the Range Rover Classic enjoyed an extremely long production run, and even the two-door version enjoyed what would now be considered an almost unheard of production run. The first models came to the market in 1970, and it was almost an instant hit. All of a sudden, the wealthy landowner or even the simple farmer had a car that could do it all without breaking their backs, without the almost unbearable noise that came with a series Land Rover. This was a grown-up car that could almost do everything, whether it be in town or in country. They were all powered by that Rover V8, a Buick-derived 3.5 litre, and it's the heart of the Range Rover. It's the very essence of what makes this car just such a versatile tool. Twin carburetors, fuel injection wouldn't come till much, much later, 1985. So those twin carburetors, very simple setup, around 130 brake horsepower and about 185 foot-pounds of torque. That meant that this car really could top 100 miles an hour. Whether I'd want to do that for an extended period of time, I'm not too sure. I imagine it's fairly noisy in here at that speed, but it was possible. You could sit all day long at 70 miles an hour in this car, which for anyone coming from a Series 2 or a Series 3 Land Rover is completely unheard of. Almost all of them were mated to this long stick LT95 transmission. It's a really hardy unit. It served many, many years of good service. 4-speed manual, overdrive on this particular model, which is engaged by this handle down here on 3rd and 4th, makes it an even more competent long distance tourer as well. So the key to the Range Rover Classic's success is its incredibly clever design. You've got a steel ladder frame chassis. You've then got a steel inner body construction with these aluminium panels hung on the side. So it's a really strong, clever construction, but it's also been, as time goes on, it's also part of its demise, because that steel chassis and that steel inner construction there can rot at an unbelievable rate. But nonetheless, it's an incredibly clever piece of design. And actually, you need to view the construction of this car kind of unlike any other car. It's a bit more like a commercial vehicle, really, the way it's put together. When you lift up the big heavy bonnet and look under there, you can see how it's all put together. Access in the engine bay is fantastic for any work that might be needed to be done. And crucially, almost all panels, interior and exterior, are widely available for these cars. So restoration is feasible and possible. But that long coil sprung suspension as well was a move away from the leaf springs that we saw on series Land Rovers. And not only does it make it a fantastically smooth ride, I mean, I don't even notice the potholes in this car, it just soaks up all the bumps. But it also, on the possible downside, makes up for some pretty incredible body roll. If you've got 4 people in this car going down a twisty country lane, you are rocking from side to side on every corner. At some points it's almost laughable, but then you compare it to a Land Rover of the period, and I know that I'd much rather be in one of these. This high up driving position, fantastic visibility all around. There's so much glass in the cabin here, and it's all the way down, so it feels light, it feels airy, doesn't feel claustrophobic even if you're sat in the back. It really is a great place to be. And of course, the Range Rover throughout that 26-year production run moved ever increasingly up market. But these earlier cars were still a fantastic blend of comfort but utilitarian. It's so basic in here. Yes, the dashboard is very much hard, cheap British Leyland plastic, and I can see the odd switchgear that's been borrowed from a British Leyland car of the era. But that's to be expected. This is a product of British Leyland, that's what they did, and it's not all that bad, to be perfectly honest. It's hard wearing and it's purposeful. So what's it like to be behind the wheel of a Range Rover Classic? And especially one as early as this. This is a 1979 example, and my first impressions are just how much it differs from my own 1987 Range Rover. You can see how the car developed subtly over those years. But that doesn't mean that this is a bad car by any means, because it's certainly not. And when I compare it to a Series 2 or Series 3 Land Rover, this is leagues ahead in terms of refinement. The power assisted steering on this model is really, really light. You get this fantastic thin rim steering wheel, which I'm always a big fan of. It just feels so nice in your hand. You can pilot this car down a twisty country road with such minor input on the steering. Yes, there's very little feedback or feel, but that doesn't really matter. It does feel very precise, and it's a very easy car to pilot. Also, the cabin in here is a lovely place to be. These big soft seats are extremely comfortable. The door frame here, absolutely perfect to place your elbow and just drive with no real effort whatsoever. Extremely good visibility as well. This glass cabin all the way round, fantastic visibility whether you're in the back or the front. It never feels claustrophobic. Headroom fantastic. And let's not forget, the Range Rover has always had one of the best driving positions of any car. Right from the get-go, they just got it right. It's such a commanding, lovely place to be. You sit high up and you can see right over the hedge tops, which is fantastic down a country lane. You can see what's coming. It's a great place to be. That 3.5 litre V8 as well is nice and torquey. It's well matched to the car. The long stick gearbox, well, it's pretty agricultural by modern standards. Takes a big old shove to get it from third to fourth, but it suits the character of the car. Engage overdrive and you can sit at 70 miles an hour in relative comfort in this car. The one thing as well that you probably have noticed in the cabin, and it's something that the Range Rover developed massively as production went on, but these early cars are quite noisy. You've got that big heavy gearbox sat right in here in the transmission tunnel, and then you've got the transfer box behind that, and they have been known pretty much right from new that they whine. So anything above 55, 60 miles an hour, you do get quite a lot of whining, transmission hum, you know, clunking and clonking as you go through the gears. It's just the nature of the car and how they're constructed. But as I say, if that's a big issue for you, the later cars were much, much more refined, much more soundproofing. But this is, to me, the perfect blend of the agricultural nature that this car was designed, but with an upmarket feel, that level of refinement that leagues above a Land Rover. It's a really nice place to be, and if it wasn't for the truly awful fuel consumption of somewhere around 14 miles to the gallon, I would get in this car and drive all the way down to the south of France with absolutely no issues whatsoever. It's supremely comfortable. Those live beam axles, coil spring suspension make it a fantastic off-road performer. We really don't need to talk about how good this car is off-road. It's been written 100 times in many, many books and covered in many videos. But this was the first car to cross the Darien Gap, and that's all you really need to know if you ever want to question just how good this car is off-road. But also on-road, which, let's be honest, is where 95% of Range Rover Classics are going to spend their time now. They're too valuable and they're too collectible to be beaten up around an off-road course. This isn't a sports car, it's a capable go-anywhere 4x4, and that's exactly what the car can do. And I'll give you an example. Let's just drop this down into third, do half throttle. And I don't care whether you're a petrol head or not, that can only ever put a smile on your face. And this old thing can really kick up a decent turn of speed. 0 to 60, around 13 seconds. Top speed, just over 100 miles an hour. It's not that slow. The only thing you'll watch as the miles per hour increase is the fuel gauge going down. That's the downside. And of course, as with all my videos, I like to just give a little piece on what to look out for if you're thinking about buying one of these cars. Now, chances are, if you are, you're already clued up. But let's just talk about some of the real absolute basics that you need to check with one of these. And the first one is rust. That really clever construction of the Range Rover Classic with a steel ladder frame chassis, a steel inner body with aluminium panels bolted to the outside is incredibly clever, but it also means that this car can essentially rot from the inside out. So be wary of a really good shiny example, because it might not be that nice underneath or inside. You've got to have a proper look at the chassis, make sure that it doesn't resemble a patchwork quilt under there. Most of these cars would have had significant work by now, so make sure it's been done to a very high standard, because restoring these cars can be very, very expensive. And the earliest examples now it can be hard to get specific parts, interior parts that are unique to Suffix A and Suffix B models. Well, they're very thin on the ground, and you will pay a huge amount of money for certain interior trim pieces just if it's the right thing for that model of car. So bear in mind, make sure everything's complete and functioning inside. But in terms of the rot, you want to be checking the chassis, you want to be checking the sills, the inner wings. They can all rot spectacularly badly. Yes, everything is fixable, but you don't want to go down that route. Check the rear boot floor as well. It's almost like a corrugated piece of metal, and it can rot out completely. So lift up all the carpets, have a good look. They of course are prone to leaking as well through the door seals, or over time when people getting in and out of them with muddy boots, soaks through the carpet and rots the floor pans out as well. So inspect every inch of this car for corrosion, and if there's significant corrosion, walk away. Other things to consider, well, that 3.5 litre Rover V8 is a tough, reliable old unit. Rebuilds are easy to do, and there's plenty of specialists that will undertake the job for you. But in terms of general maintenance, many of these cars were worked to death, and that includes the engines. They weren't looked after. They need regular oil changes. About every 3,000 miles keeps one of these in tip-top condition. Listen for ticking when it's cold as well. That's a sign that the camshafts are on the way out. Not a huge job, but it's something that perhaps you don't want to dive into straight away if you've just purchased a Range Rover. And listen for any excess clonking, banging, whining when you're driving it. Go on and off the accelerator and listen for clonking. That really will prove whether there's any significant wear in the diffs, the transfer box, and the driveline in general. A little bit of clonking is normal just because of the mechanical setup that this car has, but anything that sounds alarming, well, then you need to start thinking what's worn and how much is it going to cost me to put it right. And let's talk about the awkward thing with these cars, because they're no longer cheap. There really isn't a cheap two-door Range Rover anymore, or even four-door for that matter. For the very best examples of the earliest Suffix A's, expect to pay for an absolutely concourse example somewhere between 80 and 100,000 pounds. If you want to buy one that's been reworked by companies such as Kingsley or Land Rover's heritage operation, they will now rebuild you an almost new Range Rover Classic. Well, you won't have much change out of £200,000 for one of those. But thankfully, there are some that are more obtainable. This particular car is a Suffix F, so it's getting towards the end of the traditional two-door Range Rover build. They are less desirable, and you can probably pick up a good, usable example that's had some good quality restoration work for somewhere around 25 to 30,000 pounds. This particular car I put very much in that category. It's probably a 30 to 35,000 pound car. Very usable, not perfect, but it's had all the essential stuff done. Now, for those looking for a bit of a bargain and they can do the work themselves, remember that this car in two-door format carried on all the way through the 80s and 90s for certain markets. So you could consider importing one from the likes of Spain or Portugal. Other things to consider with those are, one, they're getting thin on the ground. Most have been now taken out of their home countries and brought back or exported to the States, who of course never got the two-door model. Those cars will mostly be left-hand drive, and a lot of them were powered by diesel engines. They used the old 2.4 VM diesel. It's a funny old unit. Some people love it, some people don't. It's got multi-head gaskets. Parts availability can be a little sketchy as well. And for me, the V8 is the heart of a Range Rover. And if you can stomach the fuel bills, just that noise alone makes it all worthwhile. But if you're dead set on a diesel, You can pick out some of those export market VM diesels. Some of them were powered by the 200 and 300 TDI. I'd be choosing that over a VM if I was you, if you were dead set on a diesel. So now I've had my first extended drive in a two-door Range Rover Classic. This is the car that started my obsession with classic cars, and Range Rovers in particular. It was the reason I bought a Range Rover Classic, albeit a four-door version, not a two-door. But has it lived up to the hype? I have to say I think it has. There's something so charming and endearing about this car that I would love to own one, and I can see why they're just so desirable. Unfortunately, the price now to pay for one of them might forevermore put it out of my budget. But I have to say, if you want 80% of the charm that a Range Rover Classic two-door gives you, consider a four-door. And I'll be doing a video that puts these side by side just to see how they compare, and to help somebody who might want to really own one of these cars see that they can still be just about obtainable. But the two-door will always be the daddy, really. It'll always be the one that people want. It's the car now that I've had this car for the entire day, driving it around, and I cannot tell you how many people have come to speak to me, asked me if it's for sale, told me that they hadn't seen one for years, and just what a beautiful car it is. And as long as that continues, prices will stay very high for these cars, but there's nothing else quite like it. I would take one of these over a series Land Rover any day of the week. I know that they have their own following. I've owned a couple of them, and for me they're just too hard work and too basic to get on with. But this I could use every day. If you can stomach the fuel bills, it's amazing that this car is such a, well, it's a design that roots back to the 1960s, but it's still so usable, so well engineered, and just so beautiful.